Coming up, the head coaching carousel finds landing spots for Ben Johnson. Familiar faces in the running for the Jacksonville Jaguars gig. We dive into it all. Plus, a surprising name on the top free agency QB list. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friend, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Marbach. Over there, Andrew Mackwitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're building towards the Commanders and the Eagles in the NFC Championship game. Everybody hating the Kansas City Chiefs and the way that the refs just love on them all too much. But before we get to any of that, Andy, how are we, sir, on a Wednesday?
I'm trying to stay warm. You know what the hardest part about now in the Northeast is, Adam? When you have, so we have a dog here. And the dog, anytime we open up the door, turns around, looks at me, and is like, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Do you think I want to go out?"
Let's clarify here. You guys have a dog, and this dog, soaking wet and wearing a 10-pound weight, weighs 11 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, he is small in stature, but big in personality.
Big in personality.
But also not being a big dog, Adam. Like when it's 6 degrees outside, he's like, "Nope, I'll just figure this out myself." And so,
yeah, he goes, by the way,
that's how cold it is right now.
No problem. I can go to the bathroom in any number of rooms in the house. It's not going to be
Don't worry. I'll take care of it myself. That's pretty much what he's telling me. But yeah, man, it's frigid outside right now.
Oh, man, it is. And I was out early this morning driving, getting in the car, like, warm up. Yeah, right. You warm up. Like, my car does not have the ability to do it. But we digress. So as we progress towards the championship round here for both the NFC and AFC, there's also been some news from a coaching standpoint. Aaron Glenn came in. He visited with the Jets extensively. He did leave the building. He is supposed to interview with the Saints later this week, but supposedly he's just putting together his coaching list and who's going to be the OC and all that stuff. But then you also get Ben Johnson, who Chicago Bears, they come sweeping in. And they shook him off his feet. They said, "Don't go anywhere, buddy. You'll stay right here in the NFC North. You'll challenge your former coach in Dan Campbell there in the Detroit Lions going forward." The question I want to ask you is, first of all, are you surprised that the Chicago Bears were the landing spot for Ben Johnson?
I am slightly surprised in terms of like the organization usually being relatively cheap. But they do have a quarterback that he looks at it and says, "I can win with this guy." And if that was his priority, is making sure that whatever team had solid quarterback play, then he has that in Chicago. And he thinks that he can get the most out of someone like Caleb Williams.
And while Chicago hasn't been, we'll say, the best run organization in recent years, comparatively to, let's say, the Jacksonville Jaguars, you don't have the same trepidations about ownership and what that's going to look like and interference, et cetera, because you do have Trevor Lawrence there. So you could look at that and say, well, I have a quarterback in place. Most other job openings, either right, is Aaron Rodgers retiring or not? What's that going to look like? The Raiders are going to get a new quarterback, right? So there's these opportunities that are out there. But you might say, well, I want to have the quarterback. And to be curious to hear, what does Ben Johnson, what did he think last year when Caleb Williams was coming out? Here's why I find it fascinating, though, because the New York Football Giants, as we know, chose to stand pat this offseason and run it back with Joe Schoen and with Brian Daboll. Then they had a bunch of people off their organization say, "Hey, we're leaving. We're going to go somewhere else. This is a mess." Do you think that Ben Johnson would have taken the New York Giants job had it been on the market? Because while they don't have Caleb Williams, they do have the ability, when we're going to talk about the draft coming up here with Mel Kiper's first board, they do have the ability to go get a quarterback in the draft. How much of you thinks that if the Giants were an open position, it at least would have been a conversation, that Ben Johnson would have come to an interview? He would not have said, "Don't bother calling me. Don't bother sending the plane. I will come in and discuss what it would look like if I took on the big blue job."
So obviously he would have a phone call. You never give up any leverage to whatever team you would essentially want to go to. Even if you didn't want to go to the Giants, you would still say, "Hey, how much you want to pay me so I can let the other teams know that they need to come up." That you pose a great question, Adam, and there is almost no chance that I think that Ben Johnson would have come here if the job was open. And it's more because you look at what's going on in Jacksonville. And you look at Ben Johnson was the favorite to be able to go there. The owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars decided that they wanted to keep Trent Baalke. Everyone was puzzled by why you would keep this GM who's whiffed a few times and it hasn't worked out with multiple coaches. Ben Johnson came back and said he didn't like the setup there. And the ownership was like, well, if you want to fire Trent Baalke, we can. If you're interested in coming, it's like, what kind of rudderless ship do we have going on here? If you're just going to like whatever candidate, the breeze is falling to is how you end up doing this. In Chicago, at least they say Ryan Poles is here. We're giving him more time. He has Caleb Williams. We're going to progress. The Giants would be Joe Shane on the hot seat and no quarterback on the roster as of today. And so for me, that feels like the worst of all of the situations in terms of what he would be stepping into year one.
Let me ask you another question on the Chicago Bears front. How much do you think this damages? Because people have been talking about it. You've heard about a little guy going around free agent market, a guard. Oh, he's going to make that Robert Hunt 5-year, $100 million. Watch your back. And everybody kind of around the Giants said, go out, you get him this offseason. You fix this line for when you draft that rookie QB. I immediately, upon the hiring of Ben Johnson and knowing that their offensive line needs help and they already have their franchise quarterback, I went, you may just want to pay attention for when things like this happen, because a team that is now has the quarterback and now has brought in the offensive mind, they're going to want to make sure that they solve problems they have, right? Even if the Giants want to do that, we have to understand, like, let's just use the Bears timeline, right? Maybe you're going to get your quarterback at the top of the draft. Okay, so you're not going to pick until the second round. Maybe you want to go into free agency. You maybe have holes at wide receiver to support Malik Neighbors. There's a lot of things to fix here. And I just think that, as you talk about with head coaching candidates as well, the Giants got to kind of read the room, and maybe the fan base needs to read the room, that it's not just you go out and offer somebody a bunch of money to come play for you. Other teams are going to be interested, and other teams are incentivized to want to go the extra step to get it done.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Adam, the Giants are light years away from competing. I don't believe that the Giants are in a situation like what just happened with the Commanders, where one quarterback changes the whole thing. Keep in mind that the Commanders changed a whole host of things, including selling of the selling of the team from a terrible owner, to putting in a up and coming competent GM, to hiring a veteran head coach who has Super Bowl experience and has done it in multiple places. Then all of a sudden you get the quarterback and you get a smart-minded offensive coordinator. It took a village to make that change. I don't think you turn around and say the Giants get Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward, and all of a sudden the infrastructure is in place for this team to win 11 or 12 games. To me, I think the Giants are from a depth perspective, from a top-end talent perspective, much further away than even a team like the Commanders, who are making an amazing run.
Yeah, and honestly, man, I don't want any credit for it. I just want to see it come to fruition. I started banging this drum back early days of the season when it looked like this thing was going to go off the rails. Just wait. I am not convinced that all of this is not just a journey to Arch Manning. And whether or not you think he's the right guy, whether it be other prospects, whatever, there's a reason why John Mara would fall under the spell of it, right? The aroma of someone related to Eli Manning. And to your point, it's like, if you want to fix this thing and you think you're going to correct it, it's really hard to make that, as everyone says, oh, just get the quarterback, you'll be the Commanders. No, you're accurately pointing it out. They changed everything to make that happen. And then, yes, it turned out that quarterback was the quarterback. And by the way, the quarterbacks coming out, while considered to be, very good prospects, are not looked at the same way that any of the top 3 quarterbacks from a year were looked in terms of immediate impact and what they're going to be like over the course of their careers.
Adam, it's probably going to be a full episode for us to create this list, but you saying that to me in the back of my mind just said, okay, there's a fork in the road. And that fork in the road is what the Giants do at the quarterback position for this next season. There's 2 or 3, or maybe 4 or 5. I don't know. You can tell me what the number is. That if they go down this path, those 5 players would indicate Brian Daboll is trying to win now. They need to go do something. There's that path. Then there's the path of they draft someone in the mid rounds, or they get a bridge quarterback, or they do whatever that signals something entirely different about what the direction is of the organization. I'm curious if you feel like it's that cut and dry in terms of what we should expect next season for the Giants. Is it as simple as like you go for someone like Jameis Winston if you are just hoping to find the next person in the draft in 26? Like, where's your head at on the decision that they're going to make about the quarterback?
Yeah, it's funny. We talked about Justin Fields before. There's already like this little bit of buzz of like, maybe the Steelers are just bring back Justin Fields. And you go, why? They were only waiting for Wilson to be healthy. Like, okay, but they still need to have something there while they think about their next option. Maybe a bigger name will come across their board. when people throw him out as being, oh, that's you should go get, maybe you catch lightning bottle and you win some games. That's such a weird, and you and I've talked about this before. It's such a weird kind of, there's the fork in the road. And then Justin Fields, to me at least, and I think you've been on the same page, it's like, and that feels like you ran off into the bushes and you're just going to forge your own path, create your own adventure. So I do agree, though, when we make that list, I think it is indicative. Now, the results will end up playing themselves out as they will, but I think it will be an indicator of, oh, Brian Daboll needs to win games now. Oh, Brian Daboll is secure beyond this upcoming season if they choose to draft the quarterback. Oh, they are just throwing darts at the wall here, and the results will be the results. And all of that will influence how high you are up in the draft next year and whether or not you think you can make those kind of moves. So I agree with you. And also, let's pin it because that is a full, possibly even supersized episode. The other thing I do want to talk about before we get to Mel Kiper's 1.0, I want to start doing, episodes 1.0. And then we'll do our 2.0 of the episode where we clean some things up, correct some errors. Is the other coaches that are going around here. Jacksonville. Talk about the two favorites right now to land the Jacksonville job that include, gosh, man, once upon a time, the way we talked about Patrick Graham before we all soured on him, he was kind of a name. He was a name that we liked inside the Giants organization.
Yeah, so it sounds like the latest news coming out of Jacksonville, we mentioned Ben Johnson spurned them and said he didn't like the setup. Liam Cohen, the offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, considered a rising up-and-coming start. Ryan Dunleavy of the New York Post even said if he had to decide today if Brian Daboll wasn't the coach next year, who would he think is going to be the coach of the Giants? He said Liam Cohen would be the coach of the Giants. So,
and we mentioned him when talking about yeah, I didn't. I said, oh, would you really trust it was someone like that? When we talked about SPYTech and whether or not he could come over, it was like, oh, would that be a tandem? Now, we didn't go all the way down that path, but it's funny that it ends up being one of the names now being tossed around.
It's one of the whispers. He was a finalist for the Jacksonville Jaguars job. He just pulled out of that and said, I'm going to come back, and he's going to be one of the highest paid offensive minds in football this upcoming year. It kind of leaves Jacksonville in a weird spot. They're flying in Robert Saleh, former Jets head coach, and Patrick Graham, former Las Vegas Raiders and Giants defensive coordinator. And those two are the co-favorites right now to be the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars next season. What's your immediate reaction to that?
Immediate reaction is if the Giants had been on the market for a head coach, I think we'd be swimming in very similar waters. we like, I said before about, oh, would Ben Johnson, whatever. I'm like, this might be the conversations that we were having. Hey, how do you feel about Patrick Graham? You think Robert Saleh got a bad beat across the stadium? So there is something here in terms of if you're a Giants fan, you weren't in love with staying the course, you go, well, it maybe would have felt a lot different if it was these two candidates as the top choices. This feels like Jacksonville and that ownership has just run themselves almost into the ground, because even though Trevor Lawrence might not be an elite quarterback, you still have a franchise quarterback, right? Like you still have some things in place there in theory, on paper, however you want to slice it. And yet it is looked at as like the wasteland, mostly because you don't know. You take the job and who knows if you're there in 2 weeks, mostly because, as you mentioned before, they go, we're keeping our GM. I mean, unless you don't like him, we can fire him. It's no big deal. Like what, you don't know what that organization is capable of. So, although good for Patrick Graham, by the way, like why not? I'd love to see out of the two, not just because of Giants ties, I'd like to see Patrick Graham get a chance because Patrick Graham deserves a chance. Robert Saleh maybe already proved he's best suited to be a DC.
Well, I think you and I have the same takeaway, that I think the Giants, through back channeling, went around the league and was like, hey, if Brian Daboll wasn't here for some reason, how attractive does this look to you, Mike Vrabel? And he was like, I'll be with the Patriots before you even fire Brian Daboll, so don't even worry about that. And they go message Ben Johnson, hey, listen, we need an offensive mind, turn this around. He's like, Joe Shane's sticking around, you don't have a quarterback, I'm not guaranteed to get one, I'll see you later. Who's the slam dunk person that you immediately would say, I would rather have this person over Brian Daboll? Sure. Are you taking Kellen Moore? Are you taking Brian Schottenheimer? Are you like who's the candidate that you look at and say they are definitively better than the guy that we have under contract in the building today? And I think to your point, seeing Robert Saleh and Patrick Graham go fly down to Jacksonville during this game of musical chairs just screams to me the Giants would have literally been in a very similar situation. And who knows? I mean, honestly, is there anyone that's still available right now that you think would be better than Brian Daboll this upcoming season?
Well, I'll throw this out there to you. If we talked about stability and we said Vrabel might be that kind of guy, a guy that was not on the market and now suddenly is. I'm not, trust me, take it with what the spirit's intended. But Mike McCarthy not coming to terms on an extension with Dallas, the guys won. Now, relative to what you think the team is ready to do and where they're going to go and the offseason moves, I will say he might be one of those candidates where you go, well, does he have a lot of options? Are the top teams banging down his door? Maybe. He may end up on the Raiders, but that's not a top team. Maybe the Saints. How do they feel about Derek Carr? Whatever. I don't know where he could end up. Maybe back as an OC somewhere, or they've even heard the rumors, connections with Aaron Rodgers. We get that kind of stuff, but they're not going that way in New York. That's at least a name. And that might be the only one, by the way. I'm only devil's advocating that, like, sometimes you don't know the name that's going to become available, and then that surprise comes on the market, and that's the risk you have to be willing to take if you were the Giants this offseason. And it's why you can say, hey, like, all right, I get running it back. And by the way, being in a position to be like, yeah, we're going to fire both these guys at the end of the year. It didn't work out. And knowing you don't have to put a failed season on a new regime's ledger.
I couldn't agree more. Adam, I literally couldn't agree more. I'm with you on this. What's fascinating, as I keep going back to on the quarterback position, what they decide to do in the draft or free agency or via trade is going to tell me everything I need to know about what's happening with Brian Daboll.
Well, then why not have that conversation? Coming up here in a second, Mel Kiper released 1.0. It's somewhat clear-cut and kind of follows what everyone is rumored to be the case 1 through 3. But he gave a caveat that I find fascinating for the New York Football Giants. Let's get into that, excuse me, here in just one moment. All right, Andy. Mel Kiper was on ESPN Radio this morning talking about his draft 1.0. He also alluded to, I won't get into certain aspects until 4.0. You got to love just the tiered system that Mel Kiper brings to this type of process.
Caveat, in his caveat after caveat after caveat, just to make sure, like, oh, things have changed. That was 1.0 that I said this guy was going to go top 10,
And then you bring a reference back later, you go, well, in mock 3.125, I did have that trade going down. But here's what I think is interesting. So he's talking about his 1 through 3. And it goes the way that people have basically suggested. Cam Ward has kind of shown up here as the number 1. He's going to go number 1. Then you get to the number 2, where either Cleveland doesn't want a quarterback or Shedeur Sanders doesn't want to play there. They go with Hunter. That's a great player, great fit. And the Giants just get Shedeur Sanders falling in their lap. Awesome. The caveat he gave that he didn't include in his mock, though, was the idea that the Raiders might be one of those teams that would call Cleveland, trade up to get their quarterback. My question to you is, if Cleveland is trading out of it, if people want to come get the QB, first, do the Giants need to be in that conversation? Do they need to be at number 3? Easiest move is to move one spot up and allow Cleveland to move one spot back and presumably still get their next top guy that they want. Do the Giants have to be in on that conversation?
The only way you have to be in on that conversation is if Brian Daboll has the same conviction that he had about Jaden Daniels. That's the only way that I see it possible.
That's fair. And so I love this idea. I love the scenario playing out. I think one of the best things for the Giants now, one of the, I'd say best things, but the best of the best would be Cleveland just takes Travis Hunter and the Giants are there at 3 and they don't want Shedeur Sanders and they allow team to come up and get him. The funny thing about perceptions is if the quarterback is sitting there, everyone is going to freak out if the Giants don't take him. So it's a little bit different to make the active choice as opposed to, teams wanted to trade up. The Raiders wanted to give a haul. They went and got their guy. Thanks so much. And then the Giants presumably end up with Hunter. There's a couple other players you could talk about there at the top. But I just like the idea of a more desperate franchise making the move to come get their QB, who, again, I'm not going to knock either one of these guys. Presumably one of them will work out and will be a very good quarterback. But it's not last year's draft class, and it's not next year's draft class, we think, at least at the very, very top of it. I hate to say, I don't want, as of this moment today, January 22nd, 2025, I do not want the Giants to take one of these quarterbacks. Like, I don't think that is the answer here for them. And we have a whole other episode to do. You and I talked off pod a couple of names that we like in the middle rounds, the late rounds at the QB position to say, hey, Brian Daboll, this isn't a Tommy DeVito. This is a guy that you should be able to show at least that you're capable of developing to a adequate to borderline successful, bridge handful of years starting quarterback.
Yeah, Adam, I am leaning towards your feelings about this as well in terms of the quarterback situation, mostly because I just think the Giants are so far away talent-wise across the roster that I don't think going and trading assets for one of these quarterbacks is going to instantly change things. I mean, how nice would it be to have Travis Hunter at number 3 And the Giants are like, well, we couldn't get our quarterback. Let's build this team the right way, not just get the quarterback and then try to smash it all together for 1 year to save Brian Daboll's job. That's the
Right.
one thing that I want to avoid at all costs in this. So if you tell me we get Travis Hunter, who is either an amazing cornerback that can play a little bit of wide receiver, or he's a cornerback that actually does try to play wide receiver and complements a guy like Malik Neighbors. To me, he has obviously the athleticism, the stamina, all the things that you want. Everyone says he's an amazing player on and off the field too. Like, I don't know, getting someone like him as opposed to reaching for a quarterback. Like, how did that work with Trey Lance and other ones? To me,
Sure.
I like the idea of I would prefer the Giants to get Travis Hunter and just openly admit that they're not going to be that good next year and build this thing the right way.
And, it's funny over on, we'll just use Tankathon because I had it up in the background here. Travis Hunter is listed as the #1 overall player on the board. Mason Graham, defensive lineman out of Michigan. Abdul Carter, edge rusher out of Penn State, had a nice game for himself, even in the losing effort against Notre Dame heading towards the national championship. And then it's Sanders right now at 4. They have Cam Ward down at 7. I think that's, been debatable and interchangeable. But Will Johnson is there at 5 out of Michigan cornerback. And then also McMillan out of the wide receiver out of Arizona. So, again, when you go to the big board and you look and you say, and it doesn't matter. I know you got to take your shots, and you and I have debated this, I think, internally, and then also with one another about, well, maybe you do just have to keep firing until you land the franchise quarterback. But you know that if you fire on a quarterback, it's probably at least 2 more years before you think about having to go to the board again. So it's funny, man, when you look at that draft board and you just see that, again, first quarterback is 4th overall, the next one is 7th overall, wherever you want to place them. There's other talent here. And the other thing that Mel Kiper did make mention of is he said it's not a deep QB class, but he does like the draft class overall. I think he's mentioned Chicago that has 2 second-round picks. He goes, I think that's a great round to pick up a lot of talent at a lot of key positions. So it's funny how that works, where the Giants are in this spot where we thought they should have been last year to get a quarterback, and we don't necessarily want them to pull the trigger on it. I find it fascinating what kind of buzz develops here between now and the actual draft night.
Yeah, it's funny. It doesn't seem like that it's top heavy with these can't miss prospects at the quarterback position. Maybe that actually allows the Giants. I keep going back to this, Adam. It's like, how do we build this thing the right way? And to me, as it sits today, I think the right way is to get the best player available at 3. I think that's going to be a non-quarterback. You mentioned Will Johnson is one of those guys. Travis Hunter is there. There's going to be these guys available. I mean, I have one more question for you about the draft. Let's say it falls the way that we think it could, with the Cleveland Browns deciding to take Travis Hunter and Shedeur Sanders is sitting there at 3. Yeah. And the Las Vegas Raiders make a phone call and they say, we'll move up to 3 in order to get Shedeur Sanders, and you can drop back to 6. We'll give you an extra first-round pick next year, a 2nd and a 4th. And what would you say if you were Joe Schoen in that spot?
Yeah, that's what I find so fascinating, right? Because now you talk about, it walks through, and that means you drop back to 6. So let's assume that you're not going to get yourself a Mason Graham and you're not going to get yourself an Abdul Carter. But Will Johnson might be there at the cornerback, right? Do you like him? You want that other wide receiver? Now, 2 cost controlled. You always talk about wide receiver where the cost goes. So only 1 year behind Malik Neighbors. You bring in another wide receiver to complement him. Big body guy, 6'5", 210, right? So, and then Will Campbell there, just LSU is 8th overall on Tankathon. Offensive tackle, interior offensive line. We know the Giants need offensive line help as well. So how hard do you have to squint and say, we're going to get a great player? And what do we get in the process by trading back with the Raiders, right? Trade back to 6, give me an extra 2nd and a 4th, whatever the metrics are going to look like. And you continue to fill out the roster. If you're Joe Schoen, and I know we talk about like job security and everything else, but the difference between, and I think this matters too, first of all, if you believe in Sanders, you believe him, you take him, right? We get that if you have conviction. But if you take the quarterback, then you immediately, when we talk about free agency, you're going to be like, we got to go spend money. We got to go adjust areas of need. And we have $43 million right now. Now we're adjusting contracts. Now we're thinking about eating dead cap to free up more cap space. You go into got to build this thing now mode, as in be at least reasonably successful this upcoming season from the QB position. The other way, when you trade back to 6, is you go, okay, so we picked up a few more bodies, addressed a few more key areas of need. And then the expectation is, Brian Daboll, can you take this roster and show that if you had the #1 quarterback plugged into it next year, you could be successful with it? And that's where I am right now. That feels like the smarter method. And by the way, if it doesn't work out and you fire Joe Schoen and Brian Dable, it also feels better for the next regime that you have more talent and you have maybe more answers across key positions.
You also have more ammo to go get a quarterback next year
Yes,
if you acquire another first round pick or a second round pick. Like
yeah,
then all of
trade
a
up,
sudden,
and I want those picks for next year's draft class. I don't need them in this year's draft class. John Mara calls down to Joe Schoen. Nope, not for you, buddy. This is our just in case fund for next
right.
year.
So it's almost like why trade up to number 2 this year in a weakened draft class when you may be able to trade back this year, get more assets in a much more talented class next year. I think
Yeah.
you and I both agree as we sit here today towards the end of January, it feels like that's the direction we would prefer.
Yes, and I think we'll be kind of against the way a lot of the fan base is leaning right now, and I understand it because there's desperation for it. But as we say, throwing good money after bad. If you feel like keeping Joe Schoen and Brian Dable was the wrong decision, that was the bad money, then don't turn around and throw the good money saying, well, then you got to go get a quarterback because you kept it. Let's be smart here, right? Try to build this roster out. Try to put it in a position where you go convince us that we should draft a quarterback next year and we should keep you around. Last thing we want to talk about here, Andrew, if we could, and you brought this to my attention. Chad Forbes, care of NFL Draft Bites, he comes in here swinging the big hammer saying top free agent quarterbacks. And we understand Sam Darnold's going to be on the top of that list. Russell Wilson coming off a good season. Certainly teams are going to look at him in the pedigree. Justin Fields, also in Pittsburgh. Where does he land on it? Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota. I like that. I appreciate that he also listed 8th here on the list. Red Rifle, Andy Dalton, as he needs to refer. And then a slew of other guys. Right, Garoppolo, we talked about him before. Trey Lance, Kyle Trask. The name I didn't mention, Andrew, the number 2 free agent quarterback on the market is your 6th overall pick, Daniel Jones.
Adam, doesn't this just kind of show how weakened the free agent free agent class of quarterbacks is? Now, listen, we can have plenty of spirited debates on whether or not Daniel Jones should be number 2 on the free agent list behind Sam Darnold as the next guy up. You could say, hey, I want Russell Wilson or I want Jameis Winston more. But the mere fact that these are the types of options that are going to be available to the Giants, and one of them that's towards the top of the rankings by Chad Forbes happens to be the guy that they decided to release so that they didn't have to pay money to next season in his injury guarantee. It feels like outside of going and making some crazy maneuver for Sam Darnold, that anybody on this list is really telling that the Giants are just trying to build up the roster as much as they can and hoping that they can hand it off, to Winston or Jimmy Garoppolo just to be able to get by next season.
Yeah, it's listed free agency. I mean, I would sit there and I would say, so Mac Jones is listed at 7. You just mentioned Garoppolo. I've talked about him before. He's listed 13th right now. I said them before, like, to me, a nice little fun combination of guys to bring in, and then maybe along with a mid to late round draft pick as well. But the one thing I'll ask you is into this: do you go back? I get the injury money and all that stuff, but the contract is the contract. Do you sit here today at all and just be like, all right, if you were thinking that you were going to run it back with Shane and Dable and you're going to whatever, just keep Daniel Jones. And I don't think that he is the second best free agent QB on the market, but I don't think that he's much lower than, say, like you said, Jameis Winston. I think he's a better option than Marcus Mariota, even though Winston's listed below Mariota. He's probably maybe in the Mac Jones kind of area. It might make sense. Something around 7 is more accurate. But like, again, I keep coming back to this and be like, yeah, figure it out. You sign him to the contract. You're stuck with him. He gets hurt. We pay him the money and we move on either way. Like, I cannot get away from that. It's not about belief in Daniel Jones. It's almost just like, this is your mess. This is what you get. Now go try to clean it up. And if you don't, you don't. I can't get away from that energy a little bit here as we work towards the offseason for the Giants.
Rubbing like a dog that pees on the carpet, as I mentioned before.
Right. You stick his nose in it.
Like my dog Otto. You're like, you made this mess. Now you clean it up, my friend, is almost how you feel. And I kind of feel that way. I honestly am just happy for Daniel Jones to go somewhere else and actually see if he can be a competent quarterback. So that makes me feel good. Really, it just came down to the numbers of, like, if Daniel Jones got hurt again and they had to guarantee all the rest of his contract for next season, it would have been an additional like $22 million the Giants would have had to pay. Question is, would you rather pay Jameis Winston $7 million, $5 million, $3 million, and have that $15 million to go elsewhere? Or would you rather just keep Daniel Jones in the building for that extra amount of money? That's kind of the trade-off that the team had to do. I can't begrudge them for saying, give me 15 extra $1 million and I'll take whatever this hodgepodge of free agent quarterbacks looks like and allocate that money elsewhere to a guard or a cornerback or a safety, like wherever else you actually need some talent across the roster.
Yeah, they'll probably spend it wrong anyway. So it's all a big wash here. Incidentally, I think there'd be a conversation for like, where does Daniel Jones sign? Like, he's somewhere near the top of the list in free agents. Like, where does he end up? Like, and do we think it'll be automatically as a backup? Do we think that there's open competition for him somewhere? Is that a possibility for him on one of these rosters across the league? Like, that is very interesting to me. Including, I don't know, do the New York Jets like bring him in if Aaron Rodgers ends up retiring and they're going to be kind of out there in no man's land? Is there a world where he's one of a couple guys that they bring into the building? And what is it going to cost? I just find it fascinating. And guess what? It's not our problem anymore. So we get to be like, hey, I hope it works out for you. Because even if it goes horribly wrong, it won't be on our table anymore. But I do find that interesting. And I find a lot of these QBs interesting. Like, you and I both agree Sam Darnold is probably not going anywhere. The tag is a very easy thing to do. Everybody else just falls into this to me. Like, what are you going to get paid? And where are you going to play? And how are you going to feel about what team you go to? Like, I find this list pretty fascinating for at least like 5 or 6 guys, right?
And at the end of the day, Adam, that is why we were ultra critical of Joe Shane signing Drew Lock for the guaranteed $5 million is not necessarily that Drew Lock isn't the guy that we wanted, but for the amount of money that you paid him. To your point, you could have gotten a whole host. Joe Flacco signed a day later for $1 million less than Drew Lock did. And if you think that they're all relatively similar in what their skill set presents you, it's going to be fascinating to me to see how much money each of these potential like free agent bridge guys is going to make.
Last 2 quarterbacks on this list, top 16 available free agent QBs are Trey Lance and Kyle Trask. You know who's not on this list? Drew Lock. He's a free agent. Hey, that's what you get, boys. Big Blue powering through in spite of all the ineptitude. We will be back in on Friday. Going to take a look at these championship games, ask the tough question. Are we going to be sad if it's the Commanders that move through? No, we hate the Eagles, but we'll flesh that out a little bit more. Who do we want coming out of the AFC as well? Going to be a fun preview. No sweat on New York Football Giants fans' backs here. We're just waiting for the offseason, waiting for the draft, and continuing this conversation about what makes the most sense in the QB room and how are the Giants going to approach the draft. So you get us over on YouTube. You get us on your podcast feeds at AMAC214, at Adam Arbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast on X. Until the next time, until the best times. As Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.